It all started on a bright Monday morning, the kind that makes you feel like you're on top of the world, the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. I woke up early, had my usual black coffee, and walked out to check on my farm animals. My little farm was my pride and joy. I had worked for years to buy this land, repair the old barn, and turn it into something that would not just sustain me but also give me a sense of purpose. Chickens clucked lazily, goats bleated as they waited for me to bring them feed, and the air smelled of fresh hay. My farm sat just outside a small community with one big downside: it was under the jurisdiction of an HOA. Now, when I first bought the property, the realtor assured me that the HOA had minimal interference in rural land. They mostly care about the neighborhood streets and landscaping, she said. They won't bother you much. I believed her. That was my first mistake. For the first year, everything was fine. Sure, they'd send the occasional newsletter about community events I never attended, or a notice reminding me to keep my mailbox painted. But I stayed out of their business, and they stayed out of mine. Until Karen moved in. Karen was the new HOA president, and from the day she arrived, everything changed. I'd heard rumors about her before I even met her. Neighbors said she was the kind of woman who patrolled the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking pictures of lawns that were half an inch too long. People whispered that she had single-handedly forced the Smiths to repaint their entire house because the shade of beige clashed with the community aesthetic. At first, I brushed it off. Surely she wouldn't bother me, a farmer whose property sat on the very edge of the community. But then came the first letter. It was written in the most formal, passive-aggressive tone possible, citing some obscure HOA bylaw that said my tractor, which I parked behind my barn, completely out of view from the main road, was an eyesore and needed to be moved. I ignored it, because frankly, I had better things to do. The second letter came 2 weeks later, this time with a fine attached. Then another. Then another. Eventually, I called their office, and after being put on hold for 45 minutes, I finally got through to Karen herself. Her voice was sharp and smug, like she enjoyed every second of making my life harder. She told me that rules were rules, and that if I didn't comply, she'd have no choice but to escalate. I tried to reason with her, explaining that this was a farm, not a suburban front yard, but she wouldn't hear it. That was the first battle I lost. I moved the tractor. But Karen didn't stop there. It was as though she had developed a personal vendetta against me. Every week, a new letter came. One week it was about my rooster crowing too early in the morning, the next it was about the color of my barn, and once she even claimed my scarecrow was a public nuisance. It was exhausting, but I still tried to play nice, hoping that if I complied enough, she'd get bored and move on. Then came the day she crossed the line. I had just returned from the feed store when I saw it, a bright orange construction barricade blocking the only road that led to my farm. At first, I thought it was some county maintenance project, but then I noticed the sign attached to it, "Road closed, authorized by HOA." My jaw nearly hit the ground. I parked my truck and marched over to the barrier, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. That's when Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, grinning like she'd just won a prize. She told me that the HOA had voted to restrict access to the road because of excessive noise from farm equipment. I stared at her in disbelief. This wasn't just inconvenient, this was my livelihood she was messing with. Without that road, I couldn't bring in feed deliveries, couldn't transport livestock, and couldn't even drive to town without taking a 12-mile detour through rocky back roads that were nearly impassable during the rainy season. I told her she had no right to do this, that this road was the only way to access my property, but she just smirked and said, "Take it up with the board." I tried. I showed up at the next HOA meeting, only to find that the board was basically just Karen and two of her friends who nodded along to whatever she said. They refused to reopen the road, citing bogus safety concerns, and told me that if I didn't like it, I could petition for a vote at next year's meeting. Next year. I left that meeting fuming. It felt like I was being strangled, trapped on my own land by a group of people who didn't care if I starved. That night, as I sat on my porch staring at the blocked road, an idea started forming in my head. It was crazy, borderline illegal, and risky as hell, but it might just work. If Karen was going to block my road, I'd build my own way out. Literally. I was going to dig a tunnel. Alright, let's continue with paragraph 2, 4,000 words, of your story. The decision to dig a tunnel wasn't one I made lightly. It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If Karen wanted to control my road, fine, I'd just make my own road, underground where she couldn't see it, where the HOA had no power. I grabbed a notebook and started sketching out rough plans that same night. I wasn't an engineer, but I had enough practical know-how from years of farming and fixing equipment to at least make something functional. I figured if the Viet Cong could dig tunnels during the war with little more than shovels and determination, I could do it too. I spent the next few days gathering supplies, shovels, pickaxes, a wheelbarrow, some plywood for support beams, and a few battery-powered work lights I found at the hardware store. I even managed to buy a small hand pump ventilation system online, the kind used for underground storm shelters. It wasn't fancy, but it would keep me from suffocating down there. Every purchase felt like part of some secret mission, like I was preparing for a heist. The key was secrecy. If Karen or anyone from the HOA found out what I was doing, they'd probably find a way to shut it down, maybe even sue me for violating some obscure, subterranean easement clause, or whatever nonsense they could cook up. So I worked only at night, after dinner, when the neighborhood was quiet and everyone was inside watching TV. I'd put on an old pair of overalls, grab my tools, and head out to the far end of my barn where no one could see me from the road. The first night was the hardest. Breaking through that initial layer of hard-packed dirt felt like trying to dig through concrete. My arms ached after just half an hour, and sweat dripped down my face despite the cool night air. But I kept going, imagining Karen's smug face every time I swung the pickaxe. By the time I called it quits for the night, I'd dug just a few feet, barely enough to fit my body, but it felt like a victory. Over the next week, I fell into a routine. By day, I ran the farm as usual, smiling politely at neighbors who had no idea I was waging an underground war against the HOA. By night, I dug. Slowly but surely, the tunnel took shape. I reinforced the walls with plywood to keep them from caving in, installed the little ventilation pump, and used an old garden cart to haul out the dirt and dump it behind my compost pile where no one would notice. It was grueling work, and more than once I wondered if I'd finally lost my mind, but the thought of giving Karen the satisfaction of seeing me trapped kept me going. About 2 weeks in, I hit my first major problem, water. It had rained heavily that day, and when I crawled down into the tunnel, I found a few inches of muddy water pooled at the bottom. Panic hit me hard. If the tunnel flooded, all my work would be ruined, and worse, I could be trapped underground. I spent the entire night digging a small drainage channel that led to a lower patch of land behind the barn, then used a sump pump I borrowed from a neighbor to get the water out. By the time I finished, my hands were blistered and raw, but the tunnel was saved. The near disaster taught me to take the project even more seriously. I added better support beams, lined parts of the floor with gravel to improve drainage, and installed a second ventilation pipe just in case. The deeper I went, the more paranoid I became. Every sound above me, a car passing, a dog barking, even the wind, made me freeze, afraid someone would hear the faint thud of my digging. I kept telling myself that no one would notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen somehow knew. One night, while I was hauling a load of dirt out of the tunnel, I spotted a pair of headlights slowing down on the road near my farm. My stomach dropped. I ducked behind the barn and peeked out just enough to see Karen's car. She sat there for a good 2 minutes, looking in the direction of my property, before driving away. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, wondering if she had seen me. After that, I became even more careful. I limited my digging to a few hours each night, kept all tools hidden during the day, and even wore gloves to avoid leaving muddy handprints around the barn. Despite the constant anxiety, there was something thrilling about it all: the secrecy, the problem-solving, the slow but steady progress. It felt like I was taking back control of my life one shovelful of dirt at a time. After nearly 6 weeks of digging, I finally broke through to the other side, a secluded patch of woods just past the HOA-controlled road. I crawled through the final stretch, covered in dirt, and when I emerged under the moonlight, I felt an overwhelming rush of triumph. I had done it. I had built my own road, my own way out, and there was nothing Karen could do to stop me. But my victory was short-lived. Just a few days after completing the tunnel, I came home to find an official-looking notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, demanding that I cease all unauthorized construction projects immediately and threatening legal action if I didn't comply. My heart sank. How did they know? Had someone seen me? Or worse, had Karen been spying on me this whole time? I crumpled the notice in my fist and tossed it aside. They might know something was happening, but they didn't know what, not yet. And if Karen wanted to play hardball, I was more than ready. What I didn't know at the time was that my secret tunnel was about to do more than just get me off my property. It was about to uncover a secret that would blow the entire HOA wide open. Perfect, let's continue with paragraph 3, 4,000 words, of your story. The night after I got the notice from the HOA, I sat in my kitchen staring at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands like it might somehow explain itself. I felt my jaw clenching tighter with every passing minute. This was supposed to be my victory, my way of taking back control. Instead, it felt like Karen was always one step ahead of me. I decided that instead of panicking, I'd double down. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped into my overalls, and headed back to the tunnel entrance. Tonight, I wasn't just going to use it, I was going to explore it more thoroughly. I had finished the tunnel just enough to crawl through, but I wanted to make it bigger, sturdier, something that could handle more than just a desperate crawl. I figured if Karen and the HOA were threatening legal action, I might as well go all in before they found a way to shut me down completely. As I worked that night, widening the tunnel, I noticed something odd. About halfway through, I hit a patch of earth that didn't feel right, softer, almost hollow. At first, I thought maybe it was just a pocket of loose soil, but as I dug further, my shovel hit something hard. The sound echoed strangely, like metal. Curious, I cleared more dirt until I uncovered what looked like the top of an old, rusted pipe. I brushed it off with my gloves, trying to figure out what it was doing there. My farm didn't have any underground utilities running through this section, and this pipe looked ancient. I followed it for a few feet and discovered that it wasn't just a single pipe, it was part of a larger structure, like some kind of buried system. My curiosity got the better of me, and I kept digging, tracing the pipe until I hit what felt like a wooden beam. That's when I realized I wasn't just finding random debris, I had stumbled upon an old, forgotten underground chamber. My heart raced as I dug around the beam, eventually clearing enough space to see what I was dealing with. Beneath the dirt was a trapdoor, rotting but still intact, sealed shut with a rusted latch. I hesitated for a long moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Who knew what was under there? Old storage? A storm shelter? Something left behind by the previous owner? Finally, I pried it open with my shovel, and the smell that hit me was musty and damp, like the air hadn't moved down there in decades. I climbed down carefully, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and found myself standing in what looked like an old cellar. There were broken crates stacked against the wall, rusted tools lying around, and strange markings carved into the wooden beams, dates, initials, maybe even symbols. It was eerie but fascinating. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just a random storage room, it was part of a whole network of tunnels, much older than mine. Some of them had collapsed, but a few were still intact, stretching out in different directions like veins under the earth. I followed one until it curved sharply to the right, and that's when I heard it, voices. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might echo through the tunnel. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low, straining to hear. The voices were faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere up ahead. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard a man laugh, a low, almost conspiratorial laugh, followed by the sound of papers rustling. Against my better judgment, I crept closer until I saw a faint glow of light coming from a crack in the tunnel wall. I peered through it and nearly fell backward from shock. On the other side of the wall was a hidden room, and inside were 3 people sitting around a table. I recognized one of them immediately, Karen. My stomach dropped. She was sitting with 2 other men I didn't recognize, and in front of them were stacks of documents, maps, and what looked like money, thick envelopes full of cash. I watched in stunned silence as they talked, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch bits and pieces of the conversation. "We've got the board vote next week," one of the men said. "Once that passes, we can push through the rezoning request." Karen nodded, smiling that same smug smile I'd seen 100 times. "Good. And make sure we keep the farmer tied up with fines until then. If he can't keep up, we can foreclose on the property and buy it for pennies." My blood ran cold. Suddenly, everything clicked, the fines, the blocked road, the harassment. This wasn't just Karen being a power-hungry busybody. This was a plan. They were deliberately trying to force me off my land so they could snatch it up cheap. Rage boiled up inside me, but I stayed quiet, forcing myself not to make a sound. I needed proof, real proof that I could use against them. Slowly, carefully, I backed out of the tunnel until I was back in my own section. My hands were shaking as I climbed out and headed back to the house, my mind racing with possibilities. The next night, I came prepared. I brought an old tape recorder, the kind I used to use for taking notes when working on equipment. I crawled back through the tunnel and returned to the spot where I could hear them. I left the recorder running for hours, capturing everything, the conversations, the planning, even Karen laughing about how stupid I was for fighting back. When I finally retrieved it, I listened to the tape and felt a grim satisfaction. I had them. But I couldn't just take this to the HOA, they were all in on it. I needed to go bigger. I spent the next week gathering as much evidence as I could. I took photos through the crack in the wall, copied down names from the documents I could see, and even managed to catch them mentioning bribes to a local zoning official. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got, but also the more determined I became. This was bigger than me now. They weren't just trying to take my farm, they were using their HOA power to run some kind of land-grabbing scheme, probably targeting other people too. I wasn't just going to save my property. I was going to bring the whole corrupt operation down. Great, let's continue with paragraph 4,000 words, of your story. The next few days felt like I was living a double life. By day, I was just the quiet farmer on the edge of town, going about my chores, waving at neighbors, pretending everything was normal. But by night, I was crawling through the earth, gathering evidence like some kind of underground detective. Every time I returned to that hidden chamber, I found more proof, contracts, maps showing planned developments, even receipts for consulting fees that were clearly just bribes under a different name. I started photographing everything with my old digital camera, careful not to use the flash. I labeled every picture, made backups, and even hid copies in a lockbox in case anything happened to me. My plan was simple, build an airtight case and then unleash it at the perfect moment. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. If I just showed up with photos and recordings, Karen and her cronies would claim I was trespassing, spinning stories, maybe even fake the minutes from their meetings to cover their tracks. I needed someone with authority, someone they couldn't easily dismiss. After thinking it over, I decided to reach out to an old friend, Dave, who worked as a local investigative journalist. Dave and I went way back, we'd played baseball together in high school before our lives took very different paths. I called him one evening, keeping my voice low, and told him I had a story that would blow the lid off a major case of corruption. He was skeptical at first. He'd heard his fair share of crackpot theories over the years, but when I mentioned Karen's name and told him I had recordings, he agreed to meet me. We met in secret at the back of my property near the tree line. I brought a flashlight, my evidence binder, and the tape recorder. When Dave listened to the recording, his eyebrows shot up. "This is gold," he whispered. "But you're going to need more than audio if you want to bring these people down." I handed him the photos, the copies of documents I'd transcribed, and even a map of the tunnel network with the secret room marked. Dave nodded slowly. "If this is real, and I believe it is, we can go to the county, maybe even the state attorney. But we need to catch them in the act, preferably with witnesses." That became the new plan: set a trap. Over the next week, Dave and I coordinated carefully. We installed a tiny wireless camera in the hidden chamber by feeding it through a narrow crack in the tunnel wall. It was battery-powered, motion-activated, and connected to a recorder I kept in the barn. Then we waited. I spent those days on edge, paranoid that Karen would somehow discover what I was doing. She came by twice, smug as ever, leaving new notices and fines taped to my door. Each one made my blood boil, but I played dumb, pretending her harassment was working. I wanted her to feel confident, to let her guard down. Finally, one Friday night, the camera captured what we'd been hoping for. Karen and the two men returned, this time with another person, someone I recognized as a local councilman. They laid out maps and started talking about the upcoming rezoning vote, mentioning specific sums of money they planned to pay under the table. Karen laughed and said, "By the time anyone figures out what's happening, we'll already own half this land." I couldn't believe my luck. This was it, the smoking gun. Dave took the footage and immediately began putting together a full exposé. Meanwhile, I started preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I wanted to be there when Karen's world came crashing down. The following week, the HOA held their monthly board meeting. I showed up right on time, binder in hand, and took a seat in the front row. Karen spotted me immediately and gave me that smug little smirk that made my blood pressure spike. The meeting started as usual, reading minutes, discussing minor complaints, until Karen got to the part about enforcement actions. She looked right at me when she announced that I was being fined again, this time for unauthorized excavation. The room erupted in whispers. That was my cue. I stood up, calm as could be, and said, "Actually, Karen, I'm glad you brought that up. Because what I've been digging uncovered something very interesting." Then I dropped the binder on the table with a loud thud. I opened it and began laying out the photos, one by one, explaining exactly what I had found. The room went silent as I played the audio recording, Karen's own voice filling the air as she detailed her plan to force me out and rezone the property. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of shock, rage, and panic. She tried to interrupt, saying the recordings were illegal, that I was trespassing, but I kept going. That's when Dave walked in, holding the camera footage. "Everything he's saying is true," he told the room. "And we've got it all on tape." He set up a small monitor and played the video, showing Karen, the councilman, and the others plotting in the secret room. Gasps filled the room. A few people actually stood up in outrage. One board member, who clearly hadn't been in on the scheme, demanded that Karen step down immediately. But it didn't stop there. Dave had already shared the footage with the county sheriff and the local news station. Within an hour, deputies showed up at the HOA office. Karen tried to storm out, but they stopped her at the door and handed her a summons. The two men she had been working with were also served, and the councilman's face turned pale when the deputies told him he was under investigation. I stood there watching it all unfold, feeling a rush of vindication. For months, Karen had tried to make my life miserable, but now the tables had turned. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before started clapping. One of them even patted me on the back and said, "It's about time someone took her down." "All right, Let's finish strong with paragraph 5, final 4,000 words, of your story. The fallout from that night was nothing short of spectacular. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. The local paper ran it on the front page, the evening news showed clips from the secret recordings, and social media was buzzing with outrage. People couldn't believe the extent of the corruption. It turned out that Karen's little scheme wasn't just about my farm, it was part of a much bigger plan to buy up several surrounding properties, rezone them for commercial use, and sell them to a development company for a massive profit. My land was just the first piece of the puzzle, the cornerstone of their plan. With my evidence out in the open, the county launched a full investigation. The councilman resigned in disgrace within days, and the two men who had been plotting with Karen lawyered up fast. As for Karen herself, she tried to play the victim at first, claiming I had invaded her privacy, and that the recordings were illegal, but it didn't work. The sheriff's office found enough evidence in that hidden room to prove she was orchestrating fraud and conspiracy. Within a week, she was arrested and charged. I was there the morning they came to take her away. I watched from my porch as the deputies escorted her to the squad car, her once perfect hair a mess, her face twisted with rage. For a moment, she locked eyes with me, and I could see that she still couldn't believe she had lost. I just tipped my hat and went back to feeding my chickens. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. But the victory wasn't just personal, it was community-wide. At the next HOA meeting, the remaining board members voted to remove Karen permanently and suspend all fines and enforcement actions related to my property. They even passed a motion to formally recognize my right to access my land via the road and to stop targeting farmers with suburban rules. It was a complete reversal from the nightmare I'd been living. Several neighbors came up to me after the meeting, apologizing for not speaking out sooner. Some of them admitted that they'd been afraid of Karen's power and influence, but now that she was gone, they wanted to rebuild the HOA into something fair. I agreed to help, not because I suddenly cared about HOA politics, but because I wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Over the next few months, we completely overhauled the HOA. We introduced term limits, transparency rules, and even a clause that prevented them from interfering with agricultural operations. The road to my farm was reopened permanently, and they even helped pay for gravel to improve it. The tunnel, though, that was my little secret. I kept it hidden, just in case I ever needed it again, though I did shore it up properly to make sure it wouldn't collapse. It stood as a reminder of what I had gone through and how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. Life slowly returned to normal after that. My farm thrived, my animals were happy, and I could finally focus on my work without worrying about Karen showing up with another clipboard and another fine. Dave's exposé won him an award for investigative journalism, and he wrote a follow-up piece about how one farmer's fight had changed the entire HOA system in our area. People from neighboring communities even started reaching out to me for advice on dealing with their own power-hungry HOAs. Sometimes I'd sit on my porch at sunset, sipping coffee, and think about how close I came to losing everything. If I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't dug that tunnel, Karen would have taken it all. Instead, I turned the tables, exposed her corruption, and saved not just my farm but the whole neighborhood from her greed. It felt good, no, it felt incredible, to know that I had beaten her at her own game. In a way, the whole ordeal had taught me something important. Sometimes, when someone blocks your road, you don't just wait for them to move. You dig your own road, no matter how hard, no matter how dirty, and you keep going until you come out the other side. And if you're lucky, you might just uncover the truth along the way.